Wake up to the depths within yourself. Wake up to the power within yourself to express yourself independently, to become your own person, to experience your own sovereignty. Keep watching to learn more.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. I'm here with my co-host Emmy Vadnais today, and we are about to have an unrehearsed, spontaneous conversation about the role of politics in our lives and in New Thinking Aloud. We are living in an extraordinary historical moment here in the United States, and I'm sure the ramifications are felt throughout the world. The 2 major political parties are at each other's throats, more so than ever before in my lifetime, and possibly as much as probably leading up to the American Civil War 150 years ago or more. So we wonder, what are we to do? How are we to address this situation when there's so much emotion, there's so much hostility, there are threats of violence, accusations of treason, accusations of politicians molesting children sexually, and at the same time, we are in an environment because of artificial intelligence sweeping the world in unpredictable ways and at a very rapid pace, and changes in the economic system due to the advent of cryptocurrency, a new generation coming of age. And so Emmy and I are going to ask ourselves the question, how are we to address this situation? Welcome, Emmy.
Thank you for having me, Jeff. It's always a pleasure to be with you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. When we were maybe perhaps a bit cautious about doing this, and at the same time, I think we need to let it flow and let people know what's on our minds. And I also would like to encourage people listening to share with us what's on your minds about this as well, because we certainly don't have the final say on any of this.
One thing I will say, which I feel pretty strongly about, and I know it's a controversial position, but I've expressed it many times on New Thinking Aloud, that my philosophy is that, and I hold this as an ideal, not as an actuality, to love everybody all the time. Everyone and everything all the time. Because I feel connected to the whole universe. I feel like it's all part of me. So even though I'm a lifelong Democrat, I have very strong political feelings about what's happening on the other side. And I have friends and people we've interviewed who are Republicans, and I know they have very strong feelings as well. So for me, the real question is, how can we address the major issues that we are facing and do it in a way that's respectful and even loving towards each other? Because from my perspective, every human being is a precious spiritual entity and deserves to be respected and acknowledged as such.
Absolutely. And I think of Martin Buber, who is a philosopher and scholar, or was, and he talked about the I-it and the I-thou relationship. And the I-it is where we take ourselves to be in relationship with something, another human being or animal, as though it's there for us for our own useful pleasure, versus considering it as having feelings or thoughts, or in fact interconnected with ourselves. And the I-thou relationship is where we recognize the interconnectedness, and that the quote other is just like us and wants to be loved, wants to be respected, at the least treated with kindness. And then he goes further to say that through relationships we can move into the eternal relationship with what he would say is God, where that I-thou relationship recognizes that we are all interconnected, which I think is paramount to the messages we share here on New Thinking Aloud.
Martin Buber was a big influence in my life, starting with my undergraduate days in college. His book, I and Thou, is a real classic. It's a book that will last for generations.
And I also really appreciate what you've been saying for many years, Jeff, about loving everybody and everything all the time. And I do have a core value or belief that I think that is ultimately why we're here on this planet, even though it can be very challenging. And certainly at times we have to have boundaries, and we need to hold others accountable if they violate those boundaries. And I think part of why we're having this conversation is because I do think we need to hold our political leaders accountable. I do think that because we have this larger-ish YouTube channel where people do look to us and those we feature on this program as perhaps some sort of guiding light or balm for their spirit. I know I have before I was involved with New Thinking Aloud. And our leaders can do better. It's in my estimation, there's a lot that's not okay that's going on. I was raised also Democratic, although my father was Republican, and my parents did divorce, so I got to see both sides. My mother went on to support the Green Party later on in life, and so I think that when I was hearing these narratives about how people are milking the system or abusing the system, I reflected on my 30 plus years of experience in healthcare. And I've worked in skilled nursing facilities, hospitals, home care, even at unhoused homeless shelters. And in my time, I have never seen anybody milk the system. In fact, most people were getting very minimal support with what they really needed in their situation. So I feel like people are being duped at the moment with this story that Medicaid needs to be cut, for example, or is being cut. And I really want people to know that my understanding is that there wasn't a really strong look at where there might be, for example, fraud or unethical behavior going on. And in my experience, it actually is often where the government or insurance companies are cutting back on services, and the fraud, if you will, is often in the paperwork versus the people receiving the services. And that's why I came to you, Jeff, and said, I feel like we need to really say something so that people can recognize that if they're being told a story and they may want to dig a little further and really see if there's accuracy to it.
I know that one of the impetuses for us to have this conversation and to do it publicly and to record it is that you watched I think a news program or a video with Greta Thunberg, the environmental activist, and she said something to the effect that people who are silent about things that are taking place are the ones who are going to have to hold themselves to blame for what may happen. That being silent is a form of complicity with what's going on. And so the key is how can you call attention to issues that are dear to you? And I'm sure that people on the other side are going to say, well, there's actually hundreds of millions of dollars in fraud taking place within the medical system, and something must be done about it. And furthermore, we can't keep spending money the way we are. The country will go bankrupt. And there are all sorts of arguments on each side of every issue. And of course, most of us don't have the time or even if we did have the time, the ability to be well informed about every single issue that's taking place, everything from healthcare to the advent of different technologies to education, to the question of how large should the government be and what power should the executive hold, et cetera, et cetera. So we're all operating in the absence of adequate information to make fully informed decisions.
Well, I have lived it for 30 plus years, and I've worked around a lot of different healthcare professionals. And so that's why I just wanted to share that particular story. And at the same time, my understanding is, at least here in the United States, this current administration, to my understanding, did not really do their homework and investigate where these dollars are really causing leaks, if you will. I don't think it's with, generally speaking anyway, I don't think it's with the people receiving the services. And I will say that I do want to hold the so-called political leaders accountable, because what I see happening is that I feel like they think that people dying is the cost of doing business. Because by cutting these services, more people are going to have less services. They're going to be experiencing neglect. And I don't think the average person has worked in the facilities like I have for most of my life since I was a teenager. And I just want to share a personal story. My own father actually died from neglect in an assisted living facility. And I'm a healthcare professional. And I was even warning them about some of their practices that they were doing. And he still sustained a head injury from a wheelchair that he shouldn't have been seated in, shouldn't have been left alone with his cognitive impairment. And he died about a week later from a couple of subdural hematomas. And at his age and what was going on neurologically, he just couldn't sustain his life. So that was happening before these cuts. And that's why I wanted to share something. And I think in the spirit of being kind, respectful, or even loving people, I think we do need to hold each other accountable. And that's why I'm so grateful to have this conversation with you today, Jeff.
On the other side of the equation, I think the feeling is that things have gotten so far out of balance that the only way to correct it is for an authoritarian leader to take control and make changes as fast as possible, so there's no opportunity for a lengthy discussion that might impede the changes that the people who want to see those changes feel must be instituted. And so they're going full speed ahead, making changes. From my point of view, I don't think this country will ever be the same again. We've used to talk about the United States as an exceptional nation. We're the oldest constitutional democracy on the planet. And we're losing it right in front of our eyes as we speak, with more and more power being ceded to the executive branch of the government, and in particular to the person of the president. Now, eventually, one might think that there'll be a president on the other side of the aisle, but one wonders, given the history, if we'll ever see a fair election again. And I know on the other side they're saying we already have had elections stolen. So we're in a situation as I see it, Emmy, where both sides are accusing the other side of lying and of deceiving the public. And either they're both correct, which some people claim. They say all politicians are liars. I want to wash my hands of all of them, or I'll just support the side that I think will benefit me personally, on the one hand. Or maybe one side is correct mostly, and the other side is mostly deceiving the public. And of course, if you're a partisan, that's what you think. And I'll admit, as a lifelong Democrat, that's exactly what I think. But then the question arises, on New Thinking Aloud, our focus has always been philosophy, psychology, health, science, and spirituality, with a heavy dose of parapsychology. And I tried and have tried for mostly, I would say, to keep politics out of the discussion 99% of the time. I think we're at an unusual moment right now where we can't just ignore politics. And on the other hand, the question is, if we don't ignore it, how do we address it?
Well, I think by having conversations like this, which is the tone you have set for many years, Jeff, is having conversations and listening to people. And I think that listening to each other is paramount right now. I personally have listened to a few people who have voted for Donald Trump. I did not vote for Donald Trump. I did vote for Kamala Harris. Sure, one could argue that there was issues in government, and there has been for a number of years. And I'm not suggesting that the status quo necessarily is the best path forward. However, I had very uncomfortable feelings about Donald Trump, not to mention his legal history. And so I think having these conversations and listening to each other is really what's needed. And when I listen to those people who voted for Donald Trump, I have to say that I felt like some of these people were listening to the marketing that was put out and bought by some of these billionaires that was quite strategic. However, when I would listen to their arguments, I felt like they were cogent up to a point, but then they fell short. And I felt like they didn't thoroughly really vet their candidate as much as they could have. I also just want to add that I think the right and left, the Democrat and Republican, I think those parties are really shifting. And even when Donald Trump was doing his marketing, in going out to speak and speaking to communities, he talked about the everyday working person, which is often what the DFL would connect with or represent. So I think that those boundaries are changing. And also going back to the Constitution, and Jeff, you and I had a conversation just before recording the other day about the Constitution, and it does begin with we the people. And I also think of Abraham Lincoln at his Gettysburg Address, where he talks about that the government is of the people, for the people, by the people. And I think we need to really hold that close to our souls and our hearts, because again, going back to Martin Buber, when we other the other people and go into tribalism and even cultish sort of leanings, that we do separate ourselves from each other. And I just want to encourage us, myself included, because I have friends who I don't agree with everything they say, but I do ask them questions and I listen, because when I listen, then we can come to common ground and we can maybe hear both sides and respect each other's views and realize that it's better to go forward together versus separately.
I'm under the impression that there are people in the political world who take a completely different viewpoint than the ones that we take. I mean, we're talking about love and peace and communication. And I think there are those, frankly, on both sides of the aisle who see this as a battle. this is war, and all's fair in love and war, as they say. So if you can gain an advantage by lying, well, that's the way the game is played, according to some. And in a larger sense, if we look at world history, we can say that we live in a very troubling time, and I'm sure we do. But on the other hand, human history is full of major conflicts, wars, famines, all sorts of persecutions, the Holocaust of all things. And I ask myself, since I believe that basically, having just conducted 14 hours or more of interviews with Tom Campbell, I'm very taken with his approach, which is that it's all consciousness, and the consciousness in which we are embedded and interconnected with wants to see us grow and evolve, and is ultimately loving. And even the most horrible things that you can imagine, child abuse, starvation, and the like, ultimately are here for our benefit. And the benefit being to teach us to love more deeply. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they succeed in that regard. So I try not to point a finger and blame the other side. I think there are larger forces at work behind all of this. And on the other hand, I get angry myself. I get a sense of righteous indignation about things that are going on with which I disagree.
Yes, and I think that those who sometimes rise into leadership positions have not maybe fully developed in their emotional intelligence, shall we say, or their wisdom. And I'm a work in progress as well. I understand that. And I've also seen a lot of pain and suffering in my life. And I've made it a mission largely in my life to alleviate a lot of pain and suffering. And I have been successful in many cases. And I think that is what is missing with this aggressive, outward, masculine. I love men. I have 4 brothers. I'm married. I have deep respect for men. However, sometimes men can be very aggressive. And I think that having a bit of more insight into some of those more compassionate, recognizing that the other is us, and living by the golden rule of doing unto others as you would do unto yourself, or the silver rule of don't do unto others of what you wouldn't do to yourself, is something that I think we is necessary, really, honestly, for even our survival going forward. And the other piece with all of this political situations going on, we live on this planet, this earth, that really needs our attention as well. And if we're going to survive here, we also need to care for our planet Earth. And I feel like some of what's happening is a smokescreen for political power, more money. When I look at what's happening with the money being moved around and shifted, I don't see money coming out of banks. I don't see money going out of pharmaceutical connections where these big businesses can make a lot of money. And I think that those values, I think money is necessary. We need that. However, not at the expense of being kind to each other and our planet Earth.
There is a class warfare, you could say, going on. It was very evident, of course, in the rise of communism and the idea that we will take from the rich and give to the masses. And what we are seeing now is a kind of reversal of that. We'll take money away from Medicaid and we will extend tax cuts, especially for the very wealthy. It does seem like a transfer of wealth from the poor to those who are already wealthy, and at the same time, because of this enormous enormous thrust in artificial intelligence and AI. You have people saying we need our billionaires more than ever because that's what's powering this growth of technology, and we're rushing headlong into technology as fast as we can because it's a race. We've got to get there ahead of the other countries or each corporation trying to get ahead of the next corporation. So even though there are many warnings, and we've issued many such warnings in our various interviews about the advent of technology, that there's a dark side to it. The potential for this massive technology to be controlled by an authoritarian government is very frightening to some people. And I think for other people, they're saying this is exactly what we need, an authoritarian leader with the power of technology. And in our interviews with James Tunney, he points out they want to embed computer chips inside of our brains and have the kind of control that would imply.
And what kind of ethics does that speak? I would be more in support of some of these billionaires if they were listening to their own inner compass and ethics that benefits all. We are a world family. Sure, we have countries, but we can live in more harmony if we choose to. And I want a leader who is teaching that versus that we need to be competitive and dominate all the time. I understand that we need to protect ourselves and have perhaps some type of military budget. In my estimation, it's gotten very extreme at the expense of other people's well-being. I also recognize that when I worked at a homeless shelter for a summer as part of a field work for my occupational therapy degree and license, that there are people, often Republicans or people who have more means or maybe were born into more privilege, that there is this viewpoint that people need to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. And I got a very up-close view of how there are people who literally are born in disadvantaged situations. Sure, they might be born with other family members who are on some type of government assistance, and it can be sometimes difficult to move past that way of thinking and get education or get a job. And those people do need support and do need help. And rather than thinking, well, these people just need to do better and work harder and get an education, maybe go hang out with some of these people and talk to them and listen to their stories. And I think it'll be very eye-opening for people.
Whose stories should we be listening to?
Well, in that example, I was just offering listening to people who are disadvantaged, who maybe are living literally in poverty, because I think there's this attitude of, well, there's people taking advantage of the system and we just need to cut them off or decrease it so they go get a job. And I can see where that's a very alluring ideology, if you will. At the same time, if you go and listen to these people or some of these people, you might have a change of heart in that viewpoint.
It's tricky. I know that when it comes to the question of welfare, for example, it's always been a political football. And it's interesting. We talked about the preamble of the Constitution, which says that the purpose of our government here in the United States, and I know many other governments, is to take care of the general welfare. So to ensure that people have an education, that they have a safety net, that they have medical care, and nobody starves, would seem to be a government responsibility based on the preamble to the Constitution. And I know there are other people who disagree with that. They say that's not the responsibility of government. That's up to the private sector. Let the religions take care of that, et cetera, et cetera. So there are these debates. And if you look at the history of humanity, There was a time, let's say Paleolithic, when we had no government at all, where everybody was pretty much fending for themselves or their tribe. And in tribal cultures, ironically, nobody seemed to starve so much. And although I'm sure there were exceptions, there were outcasts from the tribe. But as long as you were within the tribe, you got provided for one way or another. The tribe took care of its own. And I think that there is this urge, even amongst very advanced thinkers, for example, in the field of psychedelics, who talk about the idea of going back to Paleolithic times. I'm concerned that given the current trends that are taking place, it would only take a nuclear war to send us back to Paleolithic times, and we would discover for ourselves the benefits of tribalism.
I'm not suggesting that people live indefinitely on, quote, government handouts. There are ways to lift people up and do it in a way that's respectful. And Francis Moore Lepay has talked about how there is enough on this planet for everybody. There is enough on this planet for everybody. And I'm interested in a leader who wants to move forward in that kind of direction versus being, in a very soft way, shall I put it, inconsiderate of other people. And that's what I'm observing anyway.
Francis Moore Lepay, who wrote, as I remember, Diet for a Small Planet, very influential, but so was Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb, and who claimed that we are overpopulating the planet. And although I understand almost every prediction is that the population is going to start to decline because fertility rates are dropping. However, there are real issues in terms of taking care of the environment. For example, clean water is at a premium right now. Here in the United States, there are communities that don't have access to clean water. And in a country like India, where there's so many people, they're draining the water table to such an extent that there's not enough water, I don't think, for everybody already.
Well, and at the same time, you have major corporations here in even Minnesota that are outright polluting the streams and the rivers. And we are getting cutbacks on the Environmental Protection Agency. So who's going to hold these folks accountable to protect these valuable resources? And over time, it is showing itself to be water, seems to be the one that is absolutely necessary for life. And you're right, we need to be protecting this. And again, I'm interested in a leader who wants to protect these vital resources and find ways to support all of us with having access to that.
Individuals on the other side of this debate would say that it's necessary for us to treat the environment as an asset that we can use. And if we have to deplete that asset in order to build our business, who's to stop us? And there are other people who say, no, damage to the environment needs to be put on your spreadsheet. It needs to be taken into account in your balance sheet. If you destroy the environment, that's like taking money that was in your bank account and throwing it out the window. And you have to be held accountable for that. And of course, it would be so nice to have a peaceful discussion without name calling. And I'm very sensitive to name calling because it's ironic, Emmy, as a parapsychologist, we have been the brunt of all sorts of horse laughs and name calling. And who do you think it generally comes from? Are liberals. The liberal Democrats, who often tend to think of parapsychology as being the sort of superstitious fantasy that Republicans tend toward.
Well, and yet, if we're still talking about both sides, which I think at the moment we are, although I see that seems to be melting and certain transparencies and boundaries shifting with all of that. Many of these folks do believe and have some type of spiritual or religious following, and that is based on the principles, as I see it, as from parapsychology. And I don't think raping and pillaging the earth is the pathway forward. I think that if there was a leader leadership anyway, that was considering what the scientists have to say, what the bright thinkers have to say, and really weighing the best options on all sides, I feel like that would be a really good path forward. And I don't see that happening at the moment here in the United States, and it deeply saddens me. And it causes me a lot of concern. And those values that people get from their religious and spiritual practices really are about loving each other, or, loving the neighbor as yourself and being kind to each other. And on New Thinking Aloud, those concepts with parapsychology often go back to that interconnection. You mentioned Tom Campbell, where he talks about the large consciousness system. Isn't that what it's?
The LCS, larger consciousness system.
We are all interconnected in that regard. And I just want to encourage people to keep that in mind. And when somebody upsets you or triggers you, maybe take a step back and maybe invite them for a conversation. And one thing I've learned to do is to ask questions. Obviously, ask questions on New Thinking Aloud, but rather than pounding my fist and sharing what I think is right, I've learned by asking questions that it invites dialogue, and people really do want to be heard. And then again, we can perhaps come together in a way that maybe we haven't before. Although I realize that's a bit idealistic, and the train is moving very quickly at the moment. But hopefully, in some way, this conversation will slow that down.
Well, how do you think we should approach this topic, Emmy, going forward on New Thinking Aloud? A topic, or I should say a range of topics, from government policy to health to the environment to economics, and to the way elections are run, to different political organizations, to the role of science. How are we to address these things moving forward, given that we've 99% of the time avoided these topics completely?
It's something we can ignore. We can certainly choose to. In this moment, we have chosen not to, because for me personally, it was bubbling up, and I felt like it's hard for me to stay silent because, like you said earlier, I feel like then we're complicit with what's happening. And I know you and I and many people listening are fans of intuition. And if we really get quiet enough and really listen to our intuition, it can guide us forward in the best way possible, not only for ourselves, but everybody. So I think that listening to our intuition and maybe taking it on a case-by-case basis as we go forward, Jeff, which is how we did it with this conversation, choosing to have this. We talked about it, we slept on it, we reconvened, and we decided this is important to discuss. I'm also very interested in what the viewers have to say. Again, I certainly don't have all the answers. However, I do have intuition myself, and I think that there is, at the very minimum, I think that there's a lot of questions around ethics going on with current leadership here in the United States. And having worked in healthcare for a number of years, I've had to contemplate bioethical situations because I've seen people in so many different situations. For example, if they're being kept on life support, do you pull the plug? Do you keep them on life support? Well, I'm not the doctor. In many of those situations, I was not the family member making those decisions, but I've observed many of those situations. And I'm here in Minnesota. Just a few miles away is the University of Minnesota, which is known for its healthcare programming. And I've listened to bioethicists as well. And so it's something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And I think that if we can all contemplate ethics a little bit more, I think it would do us well.
Ethics are very important. At the same time, there's a kind of hypocrisy that some of the people who speak the loudest about ethics are also the ones who are the least ethical. They use these ideals as a way of presenting a false image of themselves. For example, the Gnostics, a very influential spiritual tradition, of course persecuted terribly by the Catholic Church, but still alive. And the Gnostics seem to have the attitude that this world has become the playground of dark forces. Dark forces are in charge. Dark forces pretending to be forces of light. And so the very people who proclaim ethics, the very people who proclaim religion, for example, are the ones who are perpetuating the dominance of dark forces. It's very paradoxical, but it's a tradition that is ancient. It's an ancient tradition. It has many modern advocates, and it's a tradition you can see, for example, even in Mozart's opera, the Magic Flute, where the forces of light and the forces of darkness get confused with each other. And I do think we're living in such an era where any buzzword that we might choose, love or ethics or listen to each other or intuition, can be perverted and is, in fact, being perverted by people. We had once in the Intuition Network a woman highly intuitive who became a QAnon advocate and follower, and she kept trying to persuade people to join her cult by saying, use your intuition, use your intuition. So I guess what that means is you have to distinguish between, there's a word the Jewish people use, kavanah. It's about prayer. It's like you can go through and say a prayer in a very ritualistic, meaningless, mechanical way, or you can do it with true feeling, with depth, with kavanah. And I think that's what, if anything, we're trying to encourage here on New Thinking Aloud is depth. It's people doing it with real heart, not just going through the lip service of these things, because the lip service can easily be perverted.
Yes, I love what you say about heart and feeling, and I think that is the heart of the matter. I think that when people take certain terms and twist it, or even take love and say it's really the devil, or do these twists and turns, people are really operating in a different part of their consciousness. They're more in a thought form versus being more centered within their true, authentic, compassionate selves, which is, I think, a lot of what I think our programming is about, is encouraging people to move in those directions. And I think of Robert Falconer, who has been a guest several times on New Thinking Aloud. Jeff, you've interviewed him, and
I love him. Yeah,
he was a guest on a live stream we had together. And he did a really beautiful job, I think, talking about essentially fear and love, or fear and feeling safe, or however you want to term that as well. Because obviously people like Stephen Porges, who talk about the polyvagal theory, all of us every day are scanning our environments, assessing, are we safe or is there a threat? And I think the people who want to have power and overpower ultimately have a lot of insecurities, lack of confidence, and are trying to overcompensate with that. So with Robert Falconer, he did a really lovely job talking about how when people are sensing or connecting with, or one might suggest or argue attracting, quote, dark forces, he says from an internal family system standpoint that there's an exiled part of you that needs attention, that is suffering, and that is probably attracting this, and that by focusing on yourself and doing some type of inner exploration, healing, maybe even working with a therapist, and really embracing those parts of yourself versus rejecting them or saying that they're bad or false or negative and suppressing or resuppressing content in your own psychology, that if you embrace those parts of yourself, that you're going to feel more whole, you're going to be kinder to yourself, and in turn, kinder to others, or at least more respectful at a minimum. And therefore, you will perceive and apparently attract less of these dark forces.
Well, there's a funny thing about dark forces. I'm very fond of a statement by Jesus in the Bible, love your enemies. I know we had a discussion once on New Thinking Aloud with a theologian, and I was thinking and discussing it along these lines, and he took offense, and he said, "You mean we're supposed to love the devil?" Like, come on. Certainly not. In many traditions, we're taught we love the good and hate the evil. We embrace the angels and we fight the devils. And the idea of loving the devil, which is really because I believe we're one with everything. So loving the devil is just another form of self-love. It doesn't mean acting devilish or evil towards people, but it means showing a respect for those urges within ourselves that are not socially acceptable and that we don't even want to act on because we know that we just get in trouble if we do. But they're there. They're part of our being, either as a biological or a spiritual entity. And if we're going to have complete unconditional self-love, that means embracing the dark forces. I know it's paradoxical.
And at the same time, it doesn't mean that we need to tolerate lack of boundaries or abuse, right? It's that we can, for example, love the leaders who, in my estimation, are making some very, perhaps maybe one could argue making prudent decisions, and maybe in other cases making horrible decisions, and that they're acting from their own experiences, and that by being kind and loving, that we can find perhaps a common ground and move forward. Because if we're going to have that separation, we're just going to continue to do the I-it, according to Martin Buber, and we're not going to really see ourselves in each other, and they see themselves in us. And we do want to discern and have that discernment, but when we're in our egoic, rational, linear, judging, analytical minds, we're not going to be able to have that intuitive discernment that will really serve us and others, or that we perceive as others, the best way going forward.
I think one might even say there's some science behind all of that, that there is certainly some logic that when we treat the world around us as merely a playground for us to manipulate, a sandbox for us to play in, we cut ourselves off from our own essence. That's the real tragedy to me. And it's a natural thing that we do to protect ourselves because there's so much pain in the world. And when you open up psychically, you open yourself to experiencing that pain. And since we don't want to feel pain, therefore we don't want to feel the pain of others. And the best way is not to acknowledge them as the same spiritual essence that we see in ourselves, that I hope we see in ourselves.
And Jeff, you ask, how can we go forward with these conversations? One of the things among many that I admire about you is that you often bring a balanced perspective. And I've noticed that several times in this conversation where I say one thing and then you'll say, on the other hand.
It's Libra rising.
Your Libra on your ascendant is serving us well, and we do need that balance. And again, I'm not suggesting I have all the answers. However, I will say that from personal experience, some of what I've seen with currently what's happening in this administration, is where they're making these sweeping statements or assessments without, in my opinion, doing their due diligence and homework before making these drastic changes that affect millions of people in ways that can be very negative. And I understand about being fiscally responsible, and then they should look at where all of the money is being allocated.
There's a more direct way to say what I think is in your heart, Emmy, because I'm pretty sure more than half of our viewing audience are supporters of the other political party to which neither you or I belong. I know we have roughly 2/3 of our viewers are male, so that alone says something. So here's my message to those of you who are identified as Republicans and who have listened this far to our conversation. Wake up!
Oh my gosh. What do you want them to wake up to, Jeff?
To themselves. Wake up to the depths within yourself. Wake up to the power within yourself to express yourself independently, to become your own person, to experience your own sovereignty without having any king telling you how to think and how to live your life.
Yes, yes. Oh. That maybe is the challenge and the opportunity for all of us, is to really explore our own inner sovereignty and see how that matches with our internal and external worlds, and to move forward in ways that resonate with each of us, because the fear is only going to keep us separate. It's only going to isolate people more and more. It's only going to make people act out in ways that are harmful to themselves and others. And I know it can be a challenging path to open our hearts to ourselves and others, because we don't always like what we see when we look inside of ourselves. All of us have an inner critic. And sometimes that can implore us to do better in our lives. But if we continue to be hard on ourselves, it just harms us and others. And so I like what you're saying about people getting to know themselves better and perhaps having a more comfortable relationship with yourself. And also really thinking about, do you want other people to tell you what to do? Because some of the issues at hand are making decisions for people where they don't have sovereignty, for example, over their own bodies.
I know you and I both have very strong feelings about it. And at the same time, I think we both have a lot of compassion for people who feel differently, and not just compassion for them, but a willingness to learn from them.
There are people suggesting that this is perhaps a collective karmic pathway that might be necessary for us to go through. And so I just encourage everybody, myself included, to contemplate, what really does this mean for us, and how do we want to go forward in a way that is more kind and gentler to ourselves and others? Although I know people do think of other people as bad and wrong, and we need to get rid of them. Although there can be a kinder way to do that. If the person really is part of you, how do you really want to treat them? And that would be my best suggestion to consider.
Well, Emmy, this has been a fruitful discussion. I'm glad I got that wake up out of my system. And of course, it's a message for everybody, not just people on the other side of the political aisle. Emmy, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. For those of you who are watching or listening, we will monitor the comments section carefully. It's a little risky for Emmy and I to bring this subject up, but we felt the strong need to do so. And, on the Democratic side, we feel pretty strongly that Those on the other side of the aisle have been lied to extensively, lied to in many ways about many things, not the least of which is the 2020 election. The feeling goes the other way as well. So maybe we all need to take a good, careful look.
Again, how can we go forward in a way that really is serving all of us?
I'll just close by repeating the sentiment that I began with, which is to love everyone and everything all the time.
And to take action in ways that you feel can protect others and cause the least harm to ourselves and others as well. Thank you so much, Jeff. I've enjoyed being with you as always.
Thank you, Emmy. And for those of you watching or listening, especially thank you for being with us, because you're the reason that we are here.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.